let's start talking about EmpowerID. What EmpowerID is, how we approach some of these concepts, how we solve some of these issues and some of these problems. So one of the nice things about EmpowerID is we are an all-in-one converged platform. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is all of the functionality that EmpowerID does is built, configured, managed, and created by EmpowerID, right? It's all one big, well, I won't say one big, but it's all one code base, right? So we have created the PAM functionality, we have created the role functionality, we have created the governance capabilities, we've created the risk management, we've created the policies. We haven't grown by acquisition, right? So it's a converged platform where we integrate the role management, the risk management, the identity lifecycle processes, the privileged access management, the analytics, the workflow processes, the policies, the provisioning. All that is all integrated together in one converged environment, one identity warehouse, right? So, we provide all of this functionality out of the box. We don't have to put this module, we don't have to program this module to talk to that module, to talk to this module, to talk to that module. With this database holds some information, this database holds other information, this database holds this information, and we kind of all try to make them work. It's all one platform, right? And the other aspect of being a converged platform is we can implement or we can deploy in the cloud as a SaaS offering. We can do private cloud. We can do containerized. We can do on-prem with containers in a Kubernetes environment. We can do on-prem with legacy servers with just standard Windows services. But underneath it all, it's the exact same code base. We don't have a different product if you're going for SaaS. We don't have a different product if you're doing containerized. And it's not a different product if you're doing legacy server-based install. It's all the exact same product. It's simply a matter of where we deploy it. Right. So if you're starting with an on-prem implementation and you want to go to a SaaS or a private cloud-based implementation, it's simply a matter of moving the database from here up to here, taking all the application elements and components and putting them over here now, right? And it all is going to work, right? So that's the concept of EmpowerID as a all-in-one converged platform. We give you the ability to be to stay safe in one box, not have to learn a whole bunch of different technologies in order to get one program to work, right? Now, we have a number of modules. Our licensing is, won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but we have modules that span the gamut of what people refer to as IAM in the space. We've got identity and governance administration, access management, single sign-on, privileged access management. I could talk today. And one of the unique things about our licensing is we don't license based on your user count. We license based on the managed person identity. Right, we'll get into that here in a little bit. But so with any application, with any system out there, with any organization, you're going to have hundreds of applications. Each of those applications have users. You may have got multiple domains. Each of those domains are going to have users. You can have millions of users for an organization that has 70,000 people. Right? We're going to license you based on the 70,000 people. You can implement in as many sub or lower level environments as you want. No additional licensing. We license you based on the managed identities in production. Yeah.
The core identity or person object?
It's based on the person object, but I think yeah.
Failed to account for it. Not every customer uses core identity. They count the number of human beings.
Yeah, that's basically it. Yeah.
Yeah, they don't double check.
Yeah. You're managing Phil. You get a license for Phil for the various modules, right? Not Phil's admin account and Phil's personal account and Phil's training account and Phil's sub account. You're managing Phil. We're licensed for fill, for identity governments, for compliance, for these different modules. And so it makes the licensing and the concepts a lot easier to manage and to differentiate between modules in the UI itself.
It's always trust-based licensing. It's not like timer goes off.
Yeah, typically from a from a management perspective, we license based on a subscription. Some licenses are subscription, some perpetual, some are SaaS, whatever. Typically on an annual basis, we'll do a true up. So we'll get what you're purchasing or whatever, and we'll say, okay, how many what are you using, and how many people are you using it for, and does that still comport with what you purchased? If not, okay, we see you've got 10,000 more people than you had before. You're licensed for this, so we'll do a true up at that point in time. But throughout the year, the program is not going to stop working because you have one more person than you're authorized for.
Meetings?
No, you can get just the pieces you want. Yeah, we have some customers in the old days that this was very popular. It's by group management or delegated group administration, group self-service. So you can buy just the ones you want. If you just traditional core IGA is just lifecycle and group. That's your user administration, your identity cycle, your group. If you need a custom HR connector, custom SCIM connectors, then you need the advanced instead of the regular. Groups for any type of group, SAP roles, LDAP, Azure, whatever it might be, recertification, SODs, SOD. If you need to do it at the T code, field type, value, data level for complicated systems, then you need the advanced. Yeah, role mining is for the analytical, machine learning based. Role mining pops out role clusters. If we had time for that, that'd be fun to talk about. Yeah, so different modules. Depending on what you need. And if you need another one, you can just add a license on, you can test it out. Most of them are there. Some you have to specifically choose to deploy, but most of them are just kind of, they're there. You could test it on and use them anytime you want.
Of the license will be affecting with the group management. Like we'll be having number of groups, this much. Like
so group management still per person. As most of these, there are a few exceptions, but most of them are per person. So let's say we inventory your Azure AD, your on-prem AD, your Salesforce or ServiceNow, and you're going to create person objects, which are the owner of the user accounts, the group memberships. And you may have a gajillion groups, but you're still going to pay just for group manager per person. Yeah, it's not per group volume or anything related to that.
Right. We try to keep it simple so that we don't go crazy. We don't want to go crazy trying to figure out, well, you did this and that and this and that. It's like, okay, how many people you got? What functionality are you using? There's your license.
I've been through true ups with Microsoft that have been grueling. They have very specific requirements about usage.
Mhm.
They measure usage over a year period. And you think it'd be simple, but sometimes it is very much not.
No, we have analytical scripts you can run against your database that basically tell us, what your, who your active, how many active person objects you have. I mean, you have disabled people and all that stuff like that. But how many active person objects do you have? And then we get with you and say, hey, it looks like you got this instead of that. And they say, well, that's because we got we had 2,500 things that came in as a mistake when we onboarded another system and it onboarded a bunch of people. We don't use them. So, okay, that's fine. We'll take those off. It's like, we're not going to nickel and dime you to try to get every single little penny we can out of you. We're trying to make your life easier.
Sure.
We just don't want to get screwed in the process, but that's, it's business. Yeah.
And then they would be anal about auditing themselves. So
I wish that were always true, but sometimes, just to define the term active. What's an active user over the course of the year, right?
So we don't do that. So according to the licensing language,
Yeah.
we charge you per non-deleted person object. There's a Boolean on person called deleted. where that takes it out of the compilation. So it takes the load off the system. We're not compiling access and also. So if you have, so you can keep the records because you can do rehires and all this other stuff. But if you, for people who you don't want to get licensed for, you should be flagging them as deleted. That's the technical, not per active monthly user, MAUs and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, the difficult ones have always been software based, right?
Mhm.
How many installs of a piece of software in your environment do you have? But that, you can't calculate that centrally, right? That requires inventorying all your machines.
And nobody, yeah.
And, you know, they get reimaged and then software inventory is not complete and on and on and
Yeah.
on. But, you know, you don't have to have the software installed the whole year for it to count sometimes. It's just part of it, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
This,
Yeah.
yeah.
We understand usage goes up and down and up and down. So, you know, we are a identity management platform. So how many people are you managing? You know, at the end of the year, how many people are you managing? You may have managed 2,500 more people in the summer when you had a bunch of interns come on, the rest of that stuff, but they were temporary and whatnot. And now you look at your total managed people, you're managing X amount. So that's what we're going to screw up on. We're not going to screw up a relationship because we're going to fight over how many people you had where. Just not the way we do things. All right. So now, different paradigms when we're talking about how we store data, how we look at data, right? So directory versus identity warehouse, right? So EmpowerID is an identity warehouse, an identity and entitlement warehouse, sometimes referred to as a meta directory. Basically, we are going to store the data from multiple different directories, systems, and applications that we're connected to, okay? Whereas you have like Azure or Active Directory, some of these others are just a directory. It's, you know, SAP is basically a directory, right? Now you can have a bunch of SAP systems that are all kind of looking at each other, but it's still, you know, kind of, it's a single use, it's an application, it's a directory, right? And so with EmpowerID, we'll have multiple directories that we're getting data from, and we have a single pane of glass, one database that has all that data in it, right? So you can see everything that's happening across all of your systems in one database, right? We're a meta directory, identity warehouse, right? So it gives us a lot of advantage and a lot of capabilities that you don't have in a directory centric type of application or system, right? And where that comes into play is when we're talking about, say, access analytics, role mining, access management, right? So if I'm looking at the organization as a whole, I'm looking at Joe, I want to know what Joe has access to, not just in an Active Directory, not just in SAP. I want to look at Joe's risk profile across all the systems he has access to, right? We can do that in EmpowerID because we have all of that data consolidated. I can take a look at Joe and I can see Joe has this access in these SAP systems, has this access in Active Directory, has this access in ServiceNow, has this access in Salesforce and all these other systems. And I can look at and analyze his access for SOD policies, for access management, for recertification across all these things. I can see that, okay, if he has this access in SAP, he should not have this access in the HR system or in the payroll system, right? And I can compare those accesses even though they're in separate systems, right? So giving us a common database where all of this stuff is at gives us the ability to do all of those cross systems and enterprise-wide processes. Delegated identity administration. I'm going to give someone the ability to manage all the accounts for a particular location, so a plant, or for a particular store, or a particular warehouse, right? I want that delegated authority to be for what he can access, what someone can access, or what identities they have or accounts they have in SAP, in Snow, in Active Directory, in Azure, in Exchange, you know, all these different things. I want to give this delegated administrator the ability to see everything and do stuff with all the various identities that someone has in that organization, right? So I want to see across Again, the scope of everything that's there. Risk management is a huge one for identity warehouse, all right? Because the risk management, yeah, SAP has great risk management, right? You can do risk management in SAP great, right? But it's all just within SAP, right? GRC, I'm looking at just my SAP landscape. Now, I may have 300 and some SAP instances, and I can look at that, but now I'm missing out on what do they have in Azure? What do they have in Active Directory? What do they have in Snow? What do they have in my HR system, right? So that's why the identity warehouse is a concept that we embrace and that we lead with, because we have a wide scope of view on all the various aspects of your identities. All right. Now, how does that help us when we are managing those identities? We're managing access, we're managing single sign-on, all the various aspects of identity and access management we talked about. When you have an identity warehouse, we can flow attributes between systems. We don't have to try to create a connection between Active Directory and SAP and Azure and ServiceNow and Salesforce. We're bringing it all in, we're associating with a person, and we create our attribute flow rules that says for these particular attributes, we're going to flow data into these systems for this attribute, for these systems for that attribute. We're going to be authoritative coming from this system and this attribute. We can give you a one pane of glass view on your identities and all of the attributes that they have from all the various systems, right? So you can see what Joe has as far as his attribute library, if you will, in all these various systems. And we can maintain which systems are authoritative, which ones are more subscriptive, you know, which ones are more important than others. I may have the telephone number for somebody coming from the telephone system and from HR. Which one's going to be more accurate? Probably a telephone system we're integrating with, right? So I may say that, yeah, I'll get data from both of these, but when it comes to updates, I'm going to trust the telephone system more than I trust the HR system, right? So I can do that. I can do that weighting and do that scoring. I can manage my entire landscape of attributes that way. From an authentication standpoint, if we're dealing with SSO processes, since we have all of the accounts, we have all of the identity information about all the different accounts that someone has in all these different systems, we can manage their access to those systems. We can manage the authentication processes to those systems from a federation standpoint, right? So Joe, as a person, goes to log into a particular system, right? We know Joe's account. We can send the account identity over to that system because we know what it is. We're integrated with the system, right? We have his information. Now, we can leverage his access that he has in other systems potentially to send claims, cross claims, this other system. So he's got this role, right? And because he has this role in SAP, he has this group in EmpowerID. Because he has this group in EmpowerID, he has this other management role in EmpowerID, and this role grants him access to this application, right? So I can tie all of that access together, and I can present it as a unified claim to my service provider that I'm the identity provider and authorization provider for, right? So all of that stuff combined gives us the ability to do really comprehensive management across our various systems. Any questions about identity warehouse and what that?
So, like to make the attributes sync between EID and the targets, what is the frequency of reconciliation happening? And also, can we do account specific, that is a single account specific reconciliation?
Yep, and we will have an entire section on that when we get to our connectors. So the short answer to your question is yes, you can control the attributes at an attribute per system level. You can control the attributes at the overall application or directory level. You can control the attribute process at an entire organization EmpowerID level. So we have very granular ways that we can manage the synchronization of attributes, and every system we connect to has its own schedule of when we do that synchronization, when we do that reconciliation, right?
One thing to note here, just conceptually, is it's hub and spoke. So you never do system to system synchronization. It's always the rule to sync it to the person and then to push it out to the other system. So this. I know some systems are system.
Mm-hmm. We'll definitely get into some extensive discussions on that when we start looking at our lifecycle processes and our provisioning and our synchronization processes we're going to do. Right. So now, as an identity warehouse, EmpowerID, the database is pretty extensive. All right. It's all about we manage things based on what components we have, right? So identity warehouse, just for instance, contains over 1,200 tables in the SQL database, over 600 views, over 20,000 stored procedures. I mean, we are the definition of central processing. Okay, processing is not happening on a client. It's not happening in the web. It's happening at the server, and we're pushing data, we're accumulating data, we're reconciling data, right? So we're very expandable as well. You can expand horizontally, you can expand vertically from a platform standpoint. And that's where choosing the platform that you're going to use is important, right? If you are a very large organization, you probably don't want to have physical servers with Windows services running, right? You're going to want a containerized environment in an orchestration cluster such as Kubernetes, where you can spin up service containers, you can spin them down, you can spin it, you can increase them, you can decrease them.
And we don't want any
Yeah.
honestly.
Yep. Yeah.
We still support it. There's still that little
Yep.
halfway, but
We still have a few that are doing it, but we try to steer people towards containerization because it is, from a pipeline perspective, deployment perspective, much more streamlined and optimized to manage. Right. Oh, yeah.
one thing to grasp here, any of you have experience with, let's say, with ForgeRock? Anybody can ForgeRock? So there are two different approaches in software. There's opinionated and unopinionated. So in the ForgeRock approach, there's really, we're the opposite of that. We're the extremely opinionated side of things. So in some approaches in software, ForgeRock, you start out with no schema, but hey, create your own schema. What do you want? There's a JSON file. You define your own schema. We go in the opposite end of the spectrum where we say, after 20 years of knowledge of how companies operate, we have created a schema that we think is flexible enough to handle almost every type of organization, and it's already there out of the box. You have companies, sub-companies, and it exists. And you can just use it. You don't start like the toolkit approach where what do you think the schema should be? So this is like the complete opposite end of the spectrum.
Yep. And the other great thing about EmpowerID is our availability of APIs. Okay, EmpowerID being a completely centralized server-based processor, right? Everything that we do, our web UI, everything the web UI is integrated, is accessing, is doing the API calls to our backend, right? So we have API calls for everything. If you want to run a particular workflow, there's an API call for that. If you want to do a has access call from an external system, there's an API call for that. All the processes that we do within our system are available through REST API, right? So it's a very, very friendly environment for system integration, right? For making calls, ad hoc calls to the system to get information, right? So it's all about that. Now, when we talk about our database, we're looking at our database, we're looking at a component point of view. Each of our tables we expose as components within our structure, our programming structure.
Component means it's an API object.
Mhm.
So you have account.create, account.enable, account.disable.
And we'll have a table called account, we got a table called person, we got a table called management role, a table called group, right? So when you're talking about accessing the data, you're doing it through that object-oriented process, a component-based process, right? So we have an overall resources table. This is kind of getting into nitty-gritty, but overall resources table that has every object in the world as it stands as a resource, right? But then we extend the definition of that resource by having the table for that component that defines all of the various attributes and aspects of that particular type of resource, right? In a separate table with its own schema, right? So when you want to see what are all my resources that I have, we've got one table that has basically a whole bunch of identity pointers in it. It says these are the resources. And it points to if this is a resource type of account, there's going to be account record over here that has the extended definition of what that particular component is, right? Or it's a person, it's a group, that type of thing.
Yeah, mailbox table has mailbox quota, all the quota settings, all, and O enabled, not enabled, pop enabled. So every setting of an object exists somehow as data or columns on the table.
We don't try to keep all that information in a single table.
Yeah.
We have a table that has all the resources, and then we have individual tables that represent the components that have the extended definition of what that object means.
And then one big differentiator from this is that, which we made a decision early on, and we didn't know it was a different path than a lot of vendors, is we have one object, one component called account, which represents every type of user account in any system. HR record, Active Directory, Azure, SAP, ServiceNow, they're all accounts. They're all in the account table. And we have one table called group, which could be AWS, JSON, IAM policies, IAM groups, ServiceNow groups, Ariba groups, SAP roles, profiles, composite. You get the picture. Everything that's a collection of users in any system is a group. So then from an API perspective, you have a set of workflows where it's one workflow called add account to group. So if you say, I want to add users to this group, it says, oh, which system's that group in? Oh, that's an SAP composite profile in this system. Then the next step, when you pick the users, it knows I'm only going to list user accounts from that could be added to that group. So you have one workflow, and then when it hits the workflow shape that says add account to group, it's one add account to group shape and one method called add account to group. And then way down here, it figures out, well, which system is that and which connector do I call? And the benefit of that is from an API perspective, you have account.create, account.add to group, and you don't care. You have one set of workflows that work. If you add a new system, everything works. You don't have to build
all the details of how we're communicating with the external system is that last mile. It's in the resource system definition, the the security boundary definition. We have definitions that define that connector.
Yes,
right.
Every new feature we add, like risk-based, real-time gamification, every new type of group gets the feature. I mean, it just it makes it easier.
Yeah. So the workflows and the APIs pass it off to the connector definition that then says, okay, I use this method for putting these members in this group. I use this method for deleting the group. I use this method for creating the group. I use this method for associating the group with this, what type of group it is. So all that stuff happens down here in the connector definition. Right. So we give you a very consistent business process, API process, that you can use to manipulate your data, and then funnel it down to the connector definition to then do that last mile for the system.
You have hidden the complexity from the admin user.
We what now?
You have hidden the complexity from the admin user.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's like way down. Nobody, you don't have to scale with it. Whoever works the connector is the only person that has to deal with it.
Exactly.
Question?
Yeah, and it doesn't matter if it is a custom workflow, so it is always reflected as component.
Always.
Yep.
The workflow is always at that layer dealing with component objects, yeah. And a view object, and then the components have view objects. So account view object is what you deal with in a workflow typically. It has, their manager's first name, your manager's last name. So on account, there's like an ID that points to your manager, but the view extends all the common data you want to see into one nice views object. And the views are also, you can control for each of the views, whether or not it's exposed in the REST API or not. If you consider it sensitive, you can disable it. It'll be turned off from the REST API. Each of them have authorization, who's actually allowed to call the account view dot, who you have authorization, and then you have visibility filtering. So if we want you to be able to call it, but to only be able to see the 10 people in your department, then that's built in at that low level as well. So if you can call the method and you can call the view, you can see the data, but then the visibility filter, which we'll get into a lot, controls exactly which objects and which attributes are going to be returned to you.
Yeah, thank you. I want to get the differentiation right. So the generalized conceptual account is an object, right? So a specific account is not.
A specific account is a row in the account table.
It's row in the account table, okay?
Yeah.
A resource.
And the account itself is represented as a table. There's a table called account.
Yeah, exactly. The table called accounts, the table called group, a table called group account, which represents the group. That
Makes sense. Okay. So on the PowerPoint, there's on the last point, there's a little line, objects in each table are exposed as components, which is confusing me.
Component is the
table
API.
itself represents the object, so.
Yeah, so basically what we do is we do code gen. So we generate a C# object, a business object for that it represents each component and each component view object, so that you have an object. That way you have a count dot with all the methods and the properties. Yeah.
Yeah, the account row is not a component. The account object, the account definition is your component. Okay, yeah.
I had a question.
Yeah.
I think we missed it. Going back to Vikas' question about the high availability. So what sort of availability we are talking? It's zone specific. I think the question was more about really two different location specific. So if a customers, do you provide a selection to the customers, what sort of an instance they are going to have this? A high availability instance. I'm not talking about the zones, but really two different zones or location specific.
If you're a staff customer, you can pick two different Azure regions or availability zones and have geo-replication in the Azure SQL and two Kubernetes clusters.
Correct. So, but how you, as a provider, then you ensure that these data are available in the two different locations, and if one location goes down, the other location always has the real data of the and it doesn't influence the runtime functionality, because the runtime will also have their own sort of a logic about the locations. So how exactly you guys provide it?
And I'm not a DevOps guy, but so basically you have Azure geo-replication at the SQL level. You have the Kubernetes clusters. Then that data is replicated, handled by Azure. You have Azure Front Door, which is detecting zone availability, and it does failover. Yeah.
Now, from a connection standpoint, each service or each container or each service that is hitting the database has a connector string saying, let's get the server name, all that stuff. Basically, you can put the kind of obfuscated name. You put the group. I forgot you put the group name of the replicated group, in that connector, right? So when our service is reaching out to SQL, it is always reaching out to whatever that the name for the service is, not a particular SQL server. So if one SQL server goes down and it pops up another server as the primary, the next call that happens from our services is going to go to whatever that primary is, right? So you don't have to do any kind of changes. You don't have to do any kind of manual switching or failover for now I need to communicate with this server. It's communicating with whatever that service instance is, the service instance name is. And it's hitting it. Yeah.
If you're doing people, it's not a server going down.
Mhm.
Like you have like layers of rings within each.
Mhm.
That's the whole region would have to go down, or our whole data. set
Right.
would have to go down. Yeah. Or you even build into build.
So there's nothing that you have to do in the cloud-based, in our SaaS-based environment. There's nothing you have to do to get it to come back up. Now, if you're a legacy server-based, there's things that you might need to do to make sure things are failed over properly. But from a Kubernetes cloud-based, SaaS-based environment, it's completely seamless. you don't know it's happening unless you see the logs that says, hey, this happened. Let's talk a little bit about some specific concepts, identity concepts in EmpowerID, and how we look at identities and accounts and people and all that stuff. How EmpowerID looks at identities within our identity warehouse. So EmpowerID, when we are managing we're managing identities in EmpowerID. The primary management identity that we're using is called the person object, the person identity. That's a distinct and separate identity in our identity warehouse. It's basically, you can think of it as the EmpowerID user. It's who I authenticate into EmpowerID as. All right. So EmpowerID as an application, I can log in as somebody and I can use the stuff in EmpowerID. That's the person object. All right. Now, the person identity is the identity that all of our role-based access is assigned to. Okay, so it's not an account. If I log in with an Active Directory account, the Active Directory account is not getting the access. The person object, the person identity that that account is joined to, that's the primary object. So that's the identity that is actually getting all of the role assignments for. All right. So the person identity is what you use when you are working within EmpowerID. If I'm in there doing stuff, I'm doing it as a person. That's that primary authenticated identity or authorized identity within EmpowerID. Right. Now, accounts, when we talk about accounts, that's where we're talking about all of the technology-based identities in our target systems and our source systems. All right. So it's the external systems. It's the Active Directory account, the Azure account, the CRM account, the HR account, the LDAP account, the Salesforce account, the SAP account, all those accounts, right? So we're inventorying those account objects, those technical account objects from the external systems, and we have them in EmpowerID as resources we can manage, right? The accounts themselves have no operational permissions or operational authority or operational anything inside EmpowerID. They're simply records in a database, right? So when we're talking about identities in EmpowerID, we're always going to be talking about the person identity is the one that we are doing all of our assignments to. It's the one we're managing. It's the one that's going through the identity lifecycle. Okay. The accounts, the technology accounts in our external systems are simply records we're managing. Okay. We're deciding who owns them, who they're correlated to, who they're affiliated with, what the relationship is between the account and this person identity in EmpowerID. We're managing the relationships and the references to and the correlation between those technology accounts and the person identity in EmpowerID. Right now, in EmpowerID, for purposes of being able to do consolidated management of multiple contracts, multiple personas, multiple business unit situations, business process situations that you might encounter in a real world organization, we've created what we call a core identity. You can think of the core identity as a heartbeat. That's an actual person. That's Joe that's standing over there by the door. Okay, Joe, he's a core identity. Joe may have multiple personas. He may have his administrative persona. He may have a standard persona. He may have a person identity that's associated with this particular business organization, this particular contract, right? He may be a contract. He may log in as a contractor for some days because he's operating under a particular contract. He may log in as an employee other days because he's operating under his employee contract, right? So we can have multiple person identities for Joe in EmpowerID that represent his persona within EmpowerID. But we correlate all those together under the umbrella of the core identity. Because when Joe leaves the organization, we need to know that Joe had this administrative identity. He had this contractual identity over here. He had this training identity. He had his regular identity. You know, Joe had all these different personas that he defined his position or his situation within various business objects within EmpowerID, business contracts, if you will. So a good kind of an example of that would be in a medical management system, right? Medical management, organization, like Dementi, where I might be a nurse. Okay. I'm a nurse working for the company, but on Mondays and Wednesdays, I operate out of a particular hospital, right? On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I work for a doctor's practice. On the weekends, I work for an extended care facility doing work. Now, when I'm working on Mondays and Wednesdays for the hospital, I need to have access to the applications, the data and such that I need to see the patients that I'm dealing with, to run the applications that I need for my medical charting in the hospital, whatnot. But then when I'm on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'm at the doctor's office. Now, technically, because I'm Phil and I'm a nurse in both these places, I technically have access to all the patient data in the hospital for the people I work with there, and for the doctor's office. But HIPAA regulations say if I'm working in that doctor's office, I can't have access to anything that's in that hospital. I can only have access to stuff I'm responsible for in a doctor's office, right? So when I'm logging in, and I maybe am using EmpowerID to get access to certain applications, certain medical applications and such, the claims that are going along with that identity need to be just the claims that are identifying me and what I have access to as that nurse working for this doctor's office, right? So whereas as a person, I have access to all this stuff at certain points in time, when I'm functioning within the scope of that particular practice on that particular day, I need to be isolated in the access that I have. Right. So what we do is we create two personas or two person objects for that person. Right. So when they log into EmpowerID, they can log in as Phil, the nurse working in this hospital, or they can log in as Phil, the nurse working for this doctor's office. Right. And within EmpowerID, those two person objects, those two person identities have separate and different access. Right. So if I'm operating within the scope of the doctor's practice, I only have access to the stuff I get because of that persona, that person object, that person identity I'm in with. Right. But if I leave the organization or if I do things within the organization as a whole, I need to be able to see as management, as an administrator, I need to be able to see that Phil has this access and this access and this access and this access without having to go to 5 different person identities and try to accumulate it manually. I can go and I can look at one core identity and I can see all of the various personas he has and what accounts they have and what access they have, right? And what that looks like is this. Right. So I have person, Joe, 1, 2, 3. That's my primary person, not just my HR identity, right? He's got an Active Directory account, a Facebook account. He's got accounts in management applications. He has an HR system record, right? And so all these accounts are joined to Joe. He owns those accounts, right? Joe also has an admin persona, which has a different Active Directory account associated with him, right? He's got his domain admin account, right? And then he also has other permissions within EmpowerID that he has for this persona, right? Now, I've got a core identity called Joe Smith, and admin Joe and Joe 1, 2, 3. These two person identities are joined to this core identity for purposes of overall organizational management. So I can go into the system, I can look at the core identity for Joe Smith, and I can see both admin Joe and Joe 1, 2, 3. I can see on one pane of glass, both those people. I can see on one pane of glass all the accounts that all his identities own. I can see all the groups that all his identities have. So I have one vision of all of his access, no matter which contract, business unit, organization, or whatever he's working within in my organization. Okay, so it's kind of 3 levels of identity that give us the overall picture of who that person is in my organization with all the various things that he can do, all the various organizations he works for, the business units, all that stuff. Right? Yeah.
Just for monitoring and reporting purposes, or as a core identity, Joe Smith. I come into your application and I want to use this person and that person. Is this an option? When
Yes.
I'm logging?
When I log in, it's kind of the old thing, where do you want to go today?
Yeah.
From Microsoft from years ago, right? You log in with EmpowerID and it'll say, pick the persona you're in. Okay, I can log in with the one username and password for my Joe123. And when I log in, it stops at a screen and it says, which persona do you want to use? I can select the one that I want to use, and it's going to authorize me. I've already authenticated into EmpowerID. Now it's going to authorize me as that persona. So I'll have access to the stuff that that person identity has access to and nothing else, right? So that's the whole concept. And we organize that data, going back to our component concept, we organize that data in our table structure by the fact we have a core identity table, we have the account table, we have the person tables, and there are foreign key references to an account. Will have the person ID that account is joined to. The person will have a core identity information that says this is the core identity they're joined to, right? So I can see from top down everything based on those foreign key references across all of our component tables.
It is linked in real time based on what attribute a core identity is mapped to a different person.
You get to configure that. They're just like we have join rules for accounts being joined to people. We have join rules for person objects being joined to core identities. So you can configure what those anchor attributes are that say that this person is related to this core identity. And we'll actually see that as we start looking at the onboarding processes. We're actually going to see where all that's configured, and we'll dig deep into that. You got a question?
Oh, so
It's different.
core identity is implicit that you're allowed to log in, and that other one is persona switching config, the one that you're
Yeah,
talking
'cause it
about.
sounds like when we do persona switching, it's the way that you described when logging in.
Yeah,
It sounded like
Yeah.
what we see when we do this. I'm trying to think of where you could see something tangible that links your different person objects together.
it's listed in the person, when you view the person, or if you go to the person page, you can see show the core identity.
There is a core
Yeah.
identity
Yeah.
section, okay.
But we can see this.
Yeah, I'll bring it up and show you real quick. Okay, within EmpowerID, if I go to, I've got a person object up. We're going to go through the navigation here in just a moment. Under identities, personas linked to the same core identity. Here we go. So it will show me any personas that are linked to the same. Also, all user accounts owned by the core identity. So any of those person objects that have accounts joined to them, I'll see a one pane of glass list of all of my accounts consolidated by that umbrella core identity. Yes. Yep. So in reference to the slide we were looking at, if I look at all the accounts for this core identity, I'm going to see the Active Directory account for Admin Joe. I'm going to see the Active Directory Facebook Management App and HR account for Joe123 in that one list. Yep. So we'll see the login name, domain or directory usage type, EmpowerID login. So that'll be the person object that account belongs to. Yep. And as we start going through the various labs, you're going to start seeing data pop into here because you're going to be creating data. We're going to be creating people. We're going to be having people in there. So we'll be able to see how that kind of goes and how that works. And you'll be able to, if you want, because we'll show you all the screens and everything. So even if it's not part of the of an exercise, you can always create your own rules for how someone gets into a core identity, create new people, watch them pop in, things like that. Yeah. Now, the other relationship aspect of the core identity to a person is in our termination processes, our leaver processes. You can tell the system if you want to cascade those terminations, right? So if my HR record it comes over as my contract date's up, so my primary person identity is being terminated, you can configure your leaver rules to say that I want to terminate any other person objects assigned to that core identity. right? So it will terminate me, it will terminate Joe 123. And if the rules are configured in such a way, Joe 123 terminates, and it's going to say, oh, well, there's also an admin Joe associated with this core identity. Let's terminate him, right? And then we'll have policy definitions in the provisioning policies that are controlling these accounts that then say, okay, the provisioning policy for admin Joe that controls this Active Directory account says to disable the Active Directory account on termination. Maybe the provisioning policy that controls this Active Directory account for Joe 123 says it's supposed to deprovision the Active Directory account. So the net result of the termination would be that admin Joe as a person gets terminated, his account gets disabled. Person Joe, he gets terminated, his account's deleted. So the policies are applied to the person object, as we talked about. The person identity is where all the policies, all the RBAC rules and everything are applied. So the person, the policies applied to the person are going to impact the resources that that person owns, right? And there's multiple ways to configure as we look at our lever process with our no-code event flows. You can configure it to however you want. You can scope things however you want to scope them. You could override the policy settings on something and say, I want to just disable all the accounts associated with this person, or you can say, I want to use whatever the policy dictates for that person, right? For the policy. So you can configure it any way you want. But the bottom line here is we can control processes and we can cascade processes based on the core identity and the objects underneath that core identity. Yeah, the find person page. I actually have a tab up here for core identities.
Okay, so it would be.
Yeah, it's a resource object. But I mean, there's limited things you can do with it. We don't have operations and processes and whatnot that act upon the core identity. We don't give you the workflows and whatnot to manage the core identity. It's something that's automatically managed by the system based on workflows and automated processes and jobs that we have that maintain that, right? But so you can't like go terminate a core identity, right? That's just not one of the operations we give you to do, right? So you can see things, and we can process policy events, and we can process automation events based on the relationship of the people to the core identity. But it's not something that's it's not a deeply managed object, but it is an object. And since you can't really do anything with it, it's just sitting there. Yeah, you can't authenticate as it. You can't do anything as that core identity. You can't make changes based on the core identity. You can't do any of that stuff. It's just it's an object for management purposes because we need to be able to correlate it to the other resources, but it's not something that we have created workflows and processes and whatnot that you can manage it. Alrighty. So now this could be a lot of discussion, but we'll try to keep it to minimum. When do I need a person object for an account? Right, because we saw that we have accounts joined to people, etc. But we give you the ability to manage an account separate from a person object, right? So when should I just leave an account as an account, like as a service account? I don't need a person identity for a service account, right? That's just a resource.
Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, depending on how you want to manage it, right? So if an account is going to log in to use any EmpowerID applications or user interfaces or REST APIs, because keep in mind, when an application calls a REST API, the application has to send an identity with it to say this is the identity to run that API as. That has to be a person object. It can't just be an account, right? Because the API is going to be authorized by whatever the person identity that you gave it. It's going to be authorized for that, right? So when you're calling an API to say, hey, go grab this data, go grab this information, it's an authenticated, authorized call. That API is going to say, okay, I need all these accounts. Well, it's only going to give me the accounts back that the person identity you sent with the API has authorization to see through visibility filtering, right? Or if you call an API that says, I want to run this workflow, if the person object you send as the authenticated user for that API does not have the initiate rights to that workflow, it's not going to be able to run the workflow, right? So if you're going to want to use a particular identity to call an API, that identity has to have a person object in EmpowerID. So you got if you want to be able to use it to do some sort of authorization within EmpowerID against resources, they need to have a person object. If you want to shop for access in the IAM shop, they've got to have a person object associated with them, right? So if you wanted to be able to shop in the IAM shop to elevate a service identity into a group, right? You want to be able to shop for instead of just doing an administrative assignment or something like that. If you want to do it just in time or whatever for that particular thing, then that particular account would need to have a person object associated with it, because the person object is where all the assignments and all the assignment management happens. Yeah. Now, we do have the ability to manage what we call orphan accounts. So as an owner of an account, I could run a workflow to add that account to a group without there being a person object, right?
Yeah.
I could add the account to a group. It's just if I wanted to go through the self-service process of shopping for and all that stuff, then it would need to be a person. But if I'm doing an administrative workflow to just simply add that account to a group because I own the account, I can do that, right? Because you can manage your accounts and you can manage groups and you can manage people all separately, right? Adding a person to a group does an RBAC or a security-based assignment of that person to a group. It does what we call an RBAC assignment. So we're going to make sure that the account that's joined to that person always stays in that group, right? So if I go into EmpowerID and I say, I'm going to put Phil, the person, as a member of this group, then our group membership reconciliation will go find Phil and see that this group is in this account store to go look to see if there's an account in that account store joined to Phil, and it'll put that account into that group, right? Now, from that time on, if someone goes into Active Directory, uses the computers and removes that account from that group, this group membership reconciliation within whatever period of time we have this synchronization going is going to put them back, because there's a security relationship between Phil being in that group. Now, if I just go and I do a workflow to put the account into the group and the account's not assigned to a person object, I'm just going to do an account to group association. Someone goes in Active Directory, removes that account from the group. There's no security-based relationship there between a managed object, right? It's simply an account in a group. It'll just go away, right? If they're joined, there's a difference between an account being joined to a person, as in there being a linkage between that account and that person. Difference between that, and there's a difference between Phil being a responsible party for being able to manage that group. Okay, so one is Phil has an ownership of that account, so he can do things with that account. The other is the account is actually linked to him as a managed relationship. To finish this off, if I want to be able to assign EmpowerID roles, that's that security-based relationship, right? If I want to be able to assign roles that give that policy-controlled access to that account in downstream systems, I need to have a person, because all policies are going to be associated with a person. So if I want to manage that account's access based on policy assignments, that account has to be joined to a person object that policy can be applied to. All right. And if I want attribute changes to flow back and forth, if I want to keep that account object, that account identity in the external account store, if I want to be able to manage the synchronization of those attributes from an EmpowerID based policy, then it has to have an anchor for that policy to hit, right, for doing the synchronization.
With this one.
No, we didn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. If I want to have, so EmpowerID, our password management processes, we can reset the password on a person identity within EmpowerID, and I can have synchronization rules that says that accounts in a particular account store, I can say allow password synchronization. So if I have, say, for instance, 2 or 3 different Active Directory domains, a couple SAP accounts, ServiceNow account, and I have those account stores, those underlying account store definitions set to say allow synchronization of passwords, then if I reset the password or change the password on that person, that managed person object, it will take that password when I reset it, and it will synchronize that password down and change the passwords on all of the joined accounts that belong to account stores where the account store says allow password synchronization. I think we probably talked about this enough already. Basically, you can have any number of identity providers configured to log into EmpowerID using an external identity provider. So based on that identity provider, you're gonna authenticate external to EmpowerID using that identity provider. And then when it comes into EmpowerID, basically we have a federated relationship with that external identity provider. So if I go to log into EmpowerID as a service provider, it's going to pop me out to that identity provider. I'm going to authenticate. It's going to send the account ID into EmpowerID and say, hey, this account ID properly authenticated, right? We're going to look at that. We're going to look at that account ID and we're going to see if there is a person object joined to that account. Okay. If there's not a person object joined to that account, you're out of luck. Okay, we have a number of things that can be configured to happen. We can force you to do a self-registration. We can ask you to put the email address in for a person object that you believe you own, and then we'll send a token to that account, to that email address and whatnot. So you can take some steps to authorize yourself and to get the correct person object set. Yeah, those typically consumer cases, right? But otherwise, if I authenticate with an account that is not currently set up as a person identity in EmpowerID, it's simply going to tell me, sorry, you can't authorize. We can't get you in, right? But if that account is joined to a person, it will then log you in and authorize you as that person object, not as the account, but as the person object that's joined to that account. Okay, so the IDP is just the authentication mechanism to get you understood as an identity.
Yeah. On the account store level, we have to say, well, that would make sure.
I think that, yeah.
So for example, I have a Google account and my Google account should not be used for login.
But somebody else's Google account could be used for login? No, we don't do that. I mean, not out of the box. Right now it's at the account store level. At the account store level, we would say whether Google accounts in general are allowed to authenticate, to be an authentication provider into EmpowerID.
It might be setting on the account, we have to look at it.
Yeah.
I think they might be, if we go look at it as an account, you might see it.
So the idea would be, for example, some specific locations should be able to use their Google accounts and others, maybe in North America, they should use Google, but here in Europe, they should not be allowed to use Google.
Well, how many user accounts in there right now?
Okay, we'll look at that later. I think it's the setting, but yeah.
Keep that thought in mind. We'll take a look at it later on.
And probably the coolest thing is to skip all the password stuff and just do username with password with FIDO.
Yeah. Which looks something like this.
Which is the way of the future.
So if I want to log into my lab here, passwordless login. Let me use my fingerprint.
You notice he didn't type any username at all.
Yep. And there I am. And that was dead simple to set up. If you've got, if you have your bio provider configured on your laptop, like Google, I mean not Google, but Microsoft's Hello, or Face or a PIN or fingerprint or something like that. If your workstation is configured with that, then we can. It wasn't part of our labs, but we could show them how to do it if they want. Then you can just set it up when you log into EmpowerID. You can run the workflows to manage my identity, and then it'll say I want to register an MFA. It says I want to register a FIDO, and it says okay, go ahead and do it. So you do your fingerprint, and it says okay, I understand you, and now you're set up for passwordless login. Real simple to do. We'll maybe make that part of the lab later on here.
Is it possible there to separate into different locations? So for example, in like North America, they can use finger, with the finger to log in. Something
I
like
think
this,
that
or it's all the way also.
It's controlled by your password manager policy.
Yeah.
So you could have two different policies. That one goes out.
That's based on the person. That's based on the person.
Yeah, person based, so yeah.
I was just thinking about maybe some procedures I use by multiple people and then.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, on the password manager policy, there's, you can configure that those, passwordless MFA options.
Yeah, okay.
And also, can I restrict the user account that never works with this person? For example, like I have I have a global, and I have a test account. And if I'm using already native authentication, can I restrict that I should never be logging? We should always be switching of person.
I'm not sure I understand part of what you're getting at here. Say again. Okay. All right. A few key takeaways that we just talked about, things to remember. The person is a user object in EmpowerID. Basically, that's the application identity that you're authorizing as, right? So anything you do in EmpowerID, you're doing as a person, right? Not as an account or anything else. You're a person object, okay? Not all accounts have to be people, right? I can manage orphan accounts, service principals, you know, whatever I want. I decide which ones should have a person or not. They don't have to all have people. It's only if you want to do certain things with it. You can delegate administration. Remember, accounts are just resources that we can manage. So I can delegate administration for accounts. I can set up owners for accounts, responsible parties for accounts. I can give a delegated administration to, say, the service desk folks or administrators to manage my orphan accounts for a non-human technical account. You pretty much should have person objects created for all of your active HR records, because HR records are typically, that's a person. You know, that's a human being in your organization. You probably should go ahead and have, you know, person objects created for all your active HR records, right? We talked about this, having two accounts in the same account store. You should have more than one person object. Otherwise, it'll make them look the same. And then you just kind of, yeah, that's what happens. Now we can merge the attributes for two accounts to the same account store belonging to the same person. That's the other thing, that if you have two accounts in the same, like Active Directory domain, I got two Active Directory accounts joined to the same person, it's going to flow the attributes down and make both of them look exactly the same, right? The same thing does with the groups, okay? Because remember, it's a security managed assignment of that person to the group. So we're looking at any accounts that are eligible to be in that group that person has. We'll stick them in there. Core identity, if you want to use it, we can basically correlate multiple person objects to the same entity. And the authentication to EmpowerID can be done using a person object, username, password, or any trusted IDP source. All right, so you can authenticate into EmpowerID using whatever you want, but you can only authorize into EmpowerID as a person.